Thank you, Efrat, and I would like to thank the organizers, Oded, and Melissa, and Yishai, and Raya, and up to now, I enjoyed very much all the sessions, and I hope this session, the last session, will stand in the, at least my lecture will stand in the, in what continue contributing to the themes. I assume there was a bit of a mistake that I was placed in this session. I assumed that when you read in my title Jewish Theosophists, so you thought that I will be speaking about 13th century Kabbalists. But I will not speak about them. I will speak about the real Jewish Theosophists of the 19th and 20th. No, I'm joking. It was a joke. It was a joke. Okay, so let us start. Okay, in 1930, the historian and geographer Dr. Avraham Yaakov Braver visited the Jewish community in Basra in southern Iraq. And later, he wrote about his visit in his travelogue, Avak Drachim. And this is what he writes there. A strange phenomenon exists in this community. A theosophical group which has recently emerged there amongst the members of the merchants who traveled to India. Theosophical societies and groups exist today in the metropolis of West Europe amongst the people who are tired of materialistic culture and who seek after God. I wish to become acquainted with the Jewish Theosophists and inquired about them. I was told by my informants that they were expelled from the Jewish community and were forced to establish their own synagogue, and if I'm not mistaken, also their own cemetery. At the time, as we will see, there were many other Jewish theosophists and Jewish theosophical groups around the globe. Some of them were also criticized, attacked, and in some cases banned. So in my lecture today, I would like to discuss the intra-Jewish controversies over Jewish theosophists, and especially I will concentrate on two cases: the banning of a translation of the Zohar by a Jewish theosophist in India in the late 19th century, and the excommunication of the Jewish theosophist in Basra that we just heard about. But first, I will say a few words about the Theosophical Society and its followers. The Theosophical Society was established in New York in 1875 by the journalist and lawyer Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, American, and the Russian adventurer and occultist Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. In 1879, the group moved to India and established their headquarters in Adyar in southern India. The three principles of the Theosophical Society are to form a nucleus of universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. And behind them, there's a pluralistic, as you can see, a pluralistic liberal ideology combined with a belief in perennial religion and belief in supernatural occult powers. The teachings of the Theosophical Society are mostly based on the two books written by Madame Blavatsky, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, in which she and later Theosophists continue to develop teachings about the spiritual development of humanity, incarnation and karma, the the belief in the ancient esoteric universal knowledge. And in this context, the Blavatsky and later Theosophists are very much interested in occultism, Hinduism and Buddhism, and Kabbalah. In the last decade of the 19th century, early decades of the 20th century, after the death of Blavatsky and Olcott, Annie Besant becomes the president of the Theosophical Society, which becomes really a global movement and very successful and large movement. They choose and raise Jiddu Krishnamurti, a name that maybe some of you heard of, since he was a small boy, to the role of the New World teacher. There were some schisms and offshoots, many schisms and offshoots at the time in the Theosophical Society. I will not mention all of them, I will mention just one. Anthroposophy that was established by Rudolf Steiner, was the president of the German section of the Theosophical Society before he succeeded and opened the Anthroposophical Society. In 1930, Krishnamurti rejected his role as world teacher. Since then, the movement declined. Of course, during and after the Second World War, it further declined, but it is still active today. And it had, although I think it is much less known today, he had a significant political impact, especially in India and Sri Lanka. The Congress Party in India was established by the Theosophists, so you can imagine what that means for the history of modern India, and also a very large cultural impact. In a way, I think Theosophy is the most significant precursor of New Age culture, and I think many of the practices and terms that today are associated with New Age, we can find them already in the Theosophical Society. Jews joined the Theosophical Society from its beginning. Actually, in the founding group of the Theosophical Society, there was one Jew, a person called David Etienne de Lara, a Jewish scholar of Sephardic origin, and many others joined in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I will just mention a few of them, okay? Avraham David Ezekiel, Iraqi Jew from Pune, India, who also translated Kabbalistic texts into Judeo-Arabic. That's for you, Miriam. We'll have some Judeo-Arabic here, and we'll hear much about him later, a little bit. Friedrich Eckstein, apart from being an early example of a Jewish hipster, he was a very interesting intellectual, a good friend of Freud. He was the president of the Theosophical Lodge in Vienna, and also he was the person who introduced Theosophy to Rudolf Steiner. Rabbi Hermann van Staveren, which actually, I just couldn't resist not bringing his picture. He was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society in New Zealand. So just an example also of the global spread of the Theosophical Society, and that's in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Abelson, an Anglo-Jewish rabbi and scholar, wrote a book about the Shekhinah in rabbinic literature, and also he is the person who wrote the first book, the first introduction to Jewish mysticism. That's the first book that has Jewish mysticism in its title. Another person I mentioned, again, from Poland, and a person that you may possibly are familiar with, Henryk Goldschmidt, Janusz Korczak, which people know a lot about him, I think, but not the fact that he was also a member of the Theosophical Society. And that had an impact on his pedagogical ideas. And finally, I'll mention there are many, many more. The group in South Africa, I don't know if you're aware, but most of Gandhi's friend during his years in Johannesburg and other places in South Africa were Jews. All of them were members of the Theosophical Society. Gandhi himself was very much interested in theosophy. He wasn't a member, and this is just one of them, Henry Solomon Leo Pollack. From an early period, there were attempts to form Jewish frameworks within the Theosophical Society. One of the first attempts, this is for you, Oded, followers of the Jewish philosopher Eliyahu ben Amozeg from Livorno, Italy, who himself, by the way, was interested in theosophy and the Theosophical Society. Some of his students, disciples joined and opened a Jewish lodge of Theosophists in Livorno. It existed only for a couple of years. There was another attempt, which recently I learned a little bit about, and that was in Salonika. Also at the same time, around 1907, a Theosophical Jewish group in Salonika. In 1925, Jubilee Conference of the Theosophical Society in Adyar in South India. Many Jewish delegates arrived there, and they decide to form a Jewish Theosophical Association, the Association of Hebrew Theosophists. They also planned to establish a synagogue in Adyar. It never took place, but the foundation stone was laid there, and you can see that in the picture. The aims of the Association of Hebrew Theosophists is to study Judaism in light of Theosophy and Theosophy in the light of Judaism, to spread theosophical teachings among the Jews, and to undertake any other activity which could aid in the realization of the objects of the association. The Association of Hebrew Theosophists published a few books. That's two of the books that they published, and they opened sections of the association in different locations. There was a section in India, there was a section in Poland. I don't have pictures for them. There was a lodge, a Jewish lodge in London, for those of you who read Dutch. So in Holland, there was a section of the Jewish Theosophists, and the largest section was in the United States. It was headed by Henry Samuels from Seattle, and they also published a journal called The Jewish Theosophists. It was published for about 5-6 years. In 1928, a Theosophical Lodge affiliated with the Association of Hebrew Theosophists was founded in Basra, Iraq. The president was Kaduri Ani, and we heard already about them, and we will hear some more soon. In the late 1930s, the branches of the Association of Hebrew Theosophists ceased to exist. Of course, during the war, many Jewish Theosophists perished or were displaced. However, after the war, some of the Jewish Theosophists from Europe and Arab countries emigrated to Israel and established Theosophical lodges in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and Safed. Also published a journal. Now, a few words about the background and the ideology of the Jewish Theosophists. The Jewish Theosophists came, as we saw, from different geographical areas, different ethnic backgrounds and denomination. However, predominantly, they were middle-class, Western acculturated, proficient in European language. There were several rabbis amongst them, most of them liberal Orthodox or Reform, and some scholars. I mentioned one of them. Some of them came from traditional Orthodox background, but most of them had little traditional Jewish education and did not adhere to Jewish Orthodox practice. However, many of them had a strong sense of Jewish ethnic and national identity, and many were sympathetic and some active in Zionist organization. The Jewish Theosophists aspire for a theosophical, a spiritual reform of Judaism. And as we can read here from a message they sent to the Jews in India, the Theosophists wish to help our race by bringing them to the light of Theosophy, by turning their narrow orthodoxy to a rational broad-mindedness adored with intelligent spirituality. They propose to spiritualize Judaism through, and this we can see again in the aims of the association, through the revelation of the hidden spiritual riches of the Jewish religion and the profound study of these, which will help the Jew to understand better their own religion. What are these spiritual riches of the Jewish religion? Ah. Okay, of course, that is Kabbalah, and many Jewish theosophists were interested in Kabbalah, translated Kabbalistic texts, and offered theosophical inspired interpretation of Kabbalah. If you want to read more about this, some time for self-promotion, so my recent book about the sacred doctrine of the Jews, Jewish Theosophists and the Kabbalah. Okay, finally, from the last minutes, so we reach the disputes around the Jewish Theosophists. The Jewish Theosophists, as we saw, were critical of other Jewish current, especially Jewish Orthodoxy, but also, as you can see here, they were also critical of liberal Judaism. This negative approach, of course, stimulated criticism and debates against them. For instance, as an answer to Horn's spiritualizing unspiritual Judaism, so a reader of Israel Messenger, this was a Jewish newspaper, writes, "Dear Mr. Editor, Mr. Horn, whose brochure was reviewed in your last issue, is doing a great disservice to his religion by calling the Jews unspiritual. And I would suggest to him to lift his eyes from the mist of modern theosophy and look at the glorious sunshine of Judaism." Rabbi Leo Jung from New York was a bit less gentle, writing, "Jews do not theosophy. In the Torah, they are taught a philosophical life, not a mystical nothingness. Theosophy leads Jews away from their solid duties with which our Lord has crowned us. I would certainly warn my brothers against the surrender of the religious identity, which is inevitable as they lose themselves in the unprofitable mazes of theosophical." There are many more similar exchanges of verbal blows between Jewish theosophists and their opponents in the Jewish press, but in two cases, the intra-religious dispute became more than a war of words, and involved bans, excommunication, and social division. The first is related to A.D. Ezekiel, Avraham David Ezekiel, as I mentioned before, a Baghdadi Jew who joined the Theosophical Society in Pune, India in 1882. In 1887, he opens a printing press in which he published several booklets and texts in Judeo-Arabic, including translation of Kabbalistic texts. One of them, the Idra Zuta, a very important passage from a section from the Zohar. In one of his books, introduction to one of his books, he explains why he translated what was behind this translation. And he writes, 10 years ago, some people came from America who called themselves the Sufi Society. Very interesting. I don't have time to speak about that. I met them and joined their society 5 years ago. I've seen from the writings that much of their movement was based on our Kabbalah. I was very much astonished that foreign people were experts in our wisdom of Kabbalah, while we, the Jews, were barred from it. So after much effort and sleepless nights, I studied a little of it, and what I've studied, I will reveal to my brethren. This, of course, the publication enraged rabbis from Jerusalem, Hebron, Iraq, and they wrote, this is a letter of the chief rabbi Meir Panigel of Jerusalem, published in the Chavatzelet. Our soul has grieved to hear that the two Idrot, actually it was only one, were printed in the Arabic language in the town of Pune, a town in India. Who would believe such a bad news? Who would not be upset and outraged by such a great sacrilege, etc., etc.? And it concludes the letter stating a ban on a decree against the book, that no Jew will be permitted to study the aforementioned printed Idrot in other languages. Okay, we will skip that, but the question was also reached the Ben Ish Chai, very interesting answer concerning in his responsa. Aviram Tzoref wrote about it, and his decision was that it was forbidden to translate the Idrot. The second case that I started with in page in 1928, as I said, a lodge was founded in Basra by this person, Kaduri Ani, connected to the Association of Hebrew Theosophists. A few years later, since 1931, a fierce, sometimes violent campaign against the lodge. And that was discussed by two very interesting articles by Menashe Anzel. The opponents appealed to rabbis outside the community from Iraq, but also from the British Empire and New York, also published in Arabic pamphlets against the Jewish Theosophists. And I would also just mention that the polemic was related also to inner political struggles inside the community. Kaduri was the head of the lay community, and he accused the former head of the community in embezzlement. In April 1931, the Chacham of the rabbi of the community gives a sermon against the Theosophists, which culminates in violent demonstrations against them, and finally the rabbis issue a decree of excommunication against the Jewish Theosophists. Following the excommunication, the Jewish Theosophists founded an independent community, in a minute, about which we read at the beginning. The events were reported, also reached Rabbi Yehuda Fataya, and again, a very interesting discussion in his book about it, in which he claims that the Jewish Theosophists, who he accuses them, he describes them as worshippers of the snake, reached their wrong beliefs because the rabbis did not agree to teach them Kabbalah. They were interested in Kabbalah, and the rabbis refused, and hence they turned to Hinduism and snake worship. Okay, I will conclude here, and I will skip my conclusion. I'll just say that I think it's what for me is interesting, and I hope maybe to hear from you your thoughts. Why in both cases the negative or the dispute escalated into banning and excommunication? What I can say, just in both cases, they occurred in relatively peripheral Jewish communities, although prominent rabbis were involved in them, and that it seems the theological, ideological disputes were enhanced by social and political tensions, mostly by the claims of lay people for spiritual authority and their interest in Kabbalah. And I will finish reminding you just that there is no religion higher than truth. Thank you, and sorry for it.
Thank you very much, Boaz. I would like to invite Michael Ebstein who teaches at the Department of Arabic Language and Literature and the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He specializes in classical Islamic mysticism, focusing particularly on Andalusi mysticism and on the border links between the Sunni, Shi'i, and Jewish mystical traditions. The title of his lecture will be God's Friends and Corrupt Scholars, Anti-Clerical Attitudes in Classical Islamic Mysticism.
Okay, so thank you very much, Oded and Melissa, for organizing this conference and inviting me. From what I saw this morning, it's quite an interesting conference. I apologize that I couldn't be here yesterday, and I won't be able to join tomorrow due to teaching responsibilities. So what I want to do now is it will be just a very general introduction to a certain motif in Sufi literature, Islamic mystical literature. There will be nothing new in this presentation, no chidush, I apologize. But I think that for most of us who are probably not that acquainted with classical Islamic mysticism, it will be of some benefit to get to know this very interesting anti-establishment attitude. Okay, so in Sufi literature from the 9th century onwards, in other words, from the very beginnings, of when this literature appears, we find almost in every writing a very recurrent motif or topos in which the author criticizes in a very severe and non-politically correct manner the exoteric religious scholars. Usually the scholars who are criticized are the fuqaha, the jurisprudence, the people who deal with the Sharia. Sometimes muhaddithun, in other words, people who deal with ilm al-hadith, the science of traditions going back to the Prophet Muhammad, the equivalent of the Torah Sheba'al Peh in Judaism, or sometimes ulama in general, scholars in general. These whether the jurisprudence or the people who have made their occupation with hadith a profession are usually are given different names, pejorative names. So, for instance, many are called abnai. Very often they are called abnai dunya, sons of this world, in contradistinction to us, the mystics, who are abnai al-akhirah, the sons of the world to come, ulama ba. Or they can be called ulama al-zahir, in other words, the scholars of the external manifest dimension. I will return to this term shortly. Or another interesting, less frequent term, but which is also found is in different various sources, is ulama al-rusum, rusum, from the same root as rasham in Hebrew, which can mean different things. Rusum can mean either prescriptions or customs, in other words, basically halakha, or things that people do in accordance with what the law prescribes for them. Rusum, like in Hebrew, can also mean reshamim, or traces. And in that sense, here we're beginning to be a bit more metaphysical. Rusum can mean the traces of anything physical, anything created, which is the goal of the mystics, of the mystics experience. The Sufi's experience is to reach fana, which means annihilation of his consciousness, a situation in which only the awareness of Allah remains. And in this high epistemological, spiritual, emotional state, he feels nothing. He knows nothing except apart from God himself. And in this sense, traces of anything physical or anything created are considered something negative. The ulama al-rusum can also mean the scholars who are constantly occupied with things physical or created, and not with what should be our main goal in life, which is Allah himself, God himself. And finally, rusum can also mean, in terms of philosophical and theological logic, it can mean descriptive definitions of things. Close to terms like hudud. In all these different meanings of the term rusum, we get the sense that the ordinary scholars are occupied either with what people do, their customs, what they're prescribed to do, or physical things, or their theological, philosophical definitions. Okay, again, in contradistinction to the mystic who aspires to disconnect from these things in his mystical experience. And it's very important to emphasize that criticism is aimed at the religious establishment. It's not aimed at religion per se. So we may be criticizing the jurisprudence, the fuqaha, we may be criticizing the muhaddithun, those who deal with the oral Torah, so to speak, but we're not criticizing the Sharia and the Hadith themselves. Those are considered sacred and part of the religion that we have to follow, but what we are criticizing is the establishment, the religious establishment that deals only with these affairs and that has made these affairs a profession. I'll return to this point shortly. So why is the religious establishment criticized by the Sufis in classical mystical text in Islam? First of all, the ordinary religious scholars, as I already sort of pointed out, focus on the external manifest aspect of religion rather than on its inner hidden dimension. So this binary these binary terms, zahir versus batin, the external manifest aspect versus the inner hidden aspect, is very, very fundamental in Islam in general and in different mystical and esoteric trends, and it can mean different things. Okay, soon we'll see one example of what it can mean, but I'll just generally say that for the mystics, they deal not only with the zahir, the external manifest aspect of religion, the sharia, the halakha, the texts themselves, but they also are able to penetrate and focus mostly on the inner hidden dimension. Okay, so this is their first criticism. Most scholars deal only with the external manifest aspect. And here we have, this is for you, Tzahi, a parallel dichotomy or binary distinction, more of an anthropological, sociological nature. Those who have knowledge of the batin and have the ability to penetrate into the batin are God's chosen ones, or the unique ones, the khassa khawas, literally the unique ones, or God's chosen ones, whereas most other believers, the common Muslims, including the most of religious scholars, belong to what we would call in Hebrew hehamon, amma awam, the common people, or the religious proletarian. And this, again, parallels the distinction between batin and zahir, the external manifest and the internal hidden. Okay, and this is these dichotomies are found, of course, not only in Sunni mystical literature, in Sufi writings. They're also found, of course, in Shiite writings. They're very essential for the Shiite vision of things and among the philosophers. So each of the falasifa, each of these groups views themselves as God's chosen ones, as the elite who understand the true inner hidden core of religion, contrary to the majority of believers, including scholars who don't belong to that elite, who concentrate on the shell of religion and are therefore considered the commoners, hamon. A major component of the mystical criticism, of the mystics' criticism of the exoteric scholars has to do with the a reliance on the intellect. So for the mystics, their understanding of religion, of God, of truth in general, comes from a direct connection to God of some sort. Okay, and there are many different terms that describe this. Kashf, literally unveiling or revelation, is a very common term. And in contradistinction, again, the exoteric scholars rely on their intellect, aql. And this is, of course, very problematic because the mainstream position among classical Sufi mystics is that intellect is good for certain things in life. For instance, following the Sharia, making sure that you meticulously perform everything that you need to do, and fighting your passions. Okay, the greater jihad, fighting your inner, performing your inner jihad, fighting your passions, and making sure that you're purifying yourself and so forth. But for understanding God, for understanding the world, for reaching what should be your aim at life, which is connection to the divine and getting close to the divine, aql is not a good thing. It can even hinder you from that. So in that sense, when the mystics look at the religious exoteric establishment, they see scholars who make who appoint the intellect as their main instrument of understanding things, and therefore that's problematic. And this, of course, also has to do with the issue of being chosen by God. Again, this is very important also for the Shiites, the idea that we are God's chosen ones. So only he who is chosen is able to communicate with the divine and draw close to God, and therefore the intellect is not so important. Okay, everybody has intellect, but only certain individuals, a certain elite, are able to reach the truth because they are chosen by God. Okay, and this is where, together with the exoteric scholars, people who deal with the Sharia, people who deal with the Hadith, usually we also will find criticism of the mutakallimun, people who deal with theology, with kalam, and falasifa, people who deal with philosophy. Again, all these groups share in common a reliance on the intellect, which is, for the mystic, a big problem. Two other aspects that resurface time and again in classical Islamic literature in connection with this criticism of the religious establishment is cooperation with corrupt rulers. And rulers, by definition, tend to be corrupt. So it many times the problem is not just cooperating with a ruler, but with a corrupt ruler, but cooperating with a ruler per se. This is generally a very big problem for many religious ascetics and righteous Muslims since the beginning of Islam. It's specifically very problematic for Sufis. Okay. So one of their criticisms against the esoteric scholars is this cooperation with rulers, right? If you're a qadi, a religious judge, a dayan, you will get a salary from a ruler, etc. If you're an imam in a mosque, that you will also get a salary from the ruler, and this is problematic. And the other problem is that which is of course connected to this, is that these people, the exoteric scholars, are said to be greedy. In other words, they're looking for financial benefits, or what is even worse, they're looking for personal fame. They want to be famous, they want to be followed, they want to have many students. In other words, they want social status, which is even worse than just wanting money in the Sufis' eyes. And of course, there's a very big issue in studying the relationship between mystics in Islam and the religious and political establishments. There are many studies on this in scholarship. Two noteworthy examples are it's a very classical edited volume with many articles concerning a very long period in different places and different figures and movements that touch upon this problem of the relationship between the political and religious establishments and the Sufis or Muslim mystics, and the issue of specifically of the problem of Sufism and Shia, especially in Iran from the 16th century onwards, when Iran became a Shiite state. That is also a topic that's connected to this issue, but has its own history. So it's very, very complicated. We find different examples, many negative examples, but also positive examples concerning the relationship between mystics and politicians or rulers and a religious establishment. Okay, so this is just two examples of the many studies that you'll find in the field concerning this issue. I have a few minutes, 5 minutes. This is within the original time frame, or this is like the chesed shenitan li me'ever. Okay, so I'll just there are many examples that you can give of this sort of criticism. It's really very widespread in Sufi literature. I'll give two examples. One is from Al-Muhasibi, Al-Harith Al-Muhasibi, a famous mystic theologian from Baghdad who was active in the first half of the 9th century. And his teachings, he wasn't a Sufi per se. We don't really have Sufism that early on, but his teachings formed a very important basis for the Sufi mystical tradition, which began evolving shortly after his death, a few decades after his death. So one of his, this passage, for example, discusses the problem of mubaha, vying in glory or in merits with someone else. And the problem for him is especially with scholars, bil-ilm, people who deal with knowledge, right? We can think of Shne Talmidei Chachamim Shehayu Be'irenu, the famous story novel by Shai Agnon. We know that scholars, not in the academic world, but scholars, religious scholars, tend to vie with each other who knows better and who's right and who's wrong. So the group that he's criticizing here is the muhaddithun, people who deal with hadith, the equivalent of people who deal with Mishnah and Talmud in Judaism, because when they meet with each other, they often tend to vie who knows more traditions that go back to the Prophet Muhammad. So this is a very big problem for him from a religious point of view, the self-conceit, the pride. Now, of course, Muhasibi is extremely orthodox. Hadith together with Quran is the basis for everything. We need to learn Quran and Hadith, but the problem is with when it becomes a profession and a way of gaining glory and fame. Okay, if we move on to someone who was very much influenced by Al-Muhasibi from the Jewish side, we find Bahya ibn Pakuda in his Hovot al-Levavot, Faraid al-Qulub, written in Judeo-Arabic. And we see that he also reflects this criticism of religious scholars who focus mainly on the exoteric side of religion, together with while their intentions are not pure. Okay, so it's very interesting to see that Bachya here criticizes בעלי התלמוד, אלה הטריחו עצמם להבין דברי בעלי התלמוד ולתרץ קושיותיו ולפתוח מנעוליו כדי להשיג בכך תהילה ולהתפאר בו, והם מתעלמים מחובות הלבבות. The father of the distinction between מצוות הלבבות and mitzvot האיברים is al-Muhasibi. Okay, and Bachya, as we know, wrote a whole book. His book is on this distinction between חובות הלבבות and חובות האיברים. הם מתעלמים מחובות הלבבות ונרדמים מדברים המפסידים את המעשים ואיבדו מבחר ימיהם בלימוד המצאות נדירות בפרטי המשפטים וכל מוזר מדברים הקשים בפסקי הדינים ושיננו מחלוקות בעלי השמועות במקרים הנדירים וכו'. In other words, his criticism is very similar to what we will find in Muhasibi and in other Sufi authors, in that, of course, Torah shebe'al peh, the Talmud, the Mishnah, is very important, but you can't waste your time on it, especially if your intention is to gain glory and fame. Okay, you should be focusing on something else in life, which is chovot halevavot, just like al-Muhasibi. So this is one example from the Jewish tradition that reflects this sort of thinking very critically about, I'm finishing, about the religious establishment, and I'll just end with a question whether this topos or motif continues on perhaps to certain writings within the Kabbalistic tradition. And I'm thinking especially of the Tikkunim and the Ra'aya, where we find very severe criticism of the religious establishment, which I think to at least a certain degree is unprecedented in the Jewish tradition. Speaking kama marei midrashot, that people who deal with the Talmud all the time and are looking for utra be'alma den ve'utra be'alma de'ati. In other words, they're looking for worldly gains or otherworldly gains, right? Which means that they're serious in terms of spiritual matters and religious matters, but their aim isn't pure, right? So instead of dealing with what they should be dealing with, which here is a theosophical aspect of religion, right? Uniting Shekhinah with Tiferet or whatever, they're dealing with all sorts of ridiculous things, right? And the language here is extremely severe. וימררו את חייהם בעבודה קשה, דא קושיה, בחומר, דא קל וחומר, בלבנים, בליבון הלכות. This is a very severe criticism of what you're supposed to do as a Jew, which is study Torah, right? So I will just end with the hypothesis that perhaps passages like this that we find within the Jewish medieval tradition and not only, but also the tradition of Kabbalah, perhaps this is in some way a continuation of what we find on the Islamic side, okay? This sort of anti-establishment attitude, which is quite unprecedented as far as I know, but we will hear what the Jewish folk have to say about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to invite Tzahi Weiss for the third talk. Tzahi Weiss is a senior faculty member in the Department of Literature, Language, and the Arts at the Open University of Israel. He's the author of 6 books, including Sefer Yetzirah and its contents, published in Penn 2018, and Rethinking the Beginning of the Kabbalah, published in Hebrew by the Bialik Press in 2024. And it's a very good book. And forthcoming in July with Stanford University Press. a catalog of commentaries on the 10 Sefirot, which he edited together with Naama Ben Shachar, is also forthcoming and includes about 50 previously unpublished commentaries. The title of his lecture will be Meir ben Shimon of Narbonne's Meshiv Nefesh and the Problem of Individual Providence.
Thank you all. Thank you, Efrat, for the nice presentation. Thank you, both of you, Misha and Melissa, for organizing, and thank you, Oded, for being a nice chair. Okay, do you hear me well? Okay, I'm sorry, I have to take off my glasses. It says something about my age. The late 12th and early 13th centuries were an extremely ordinary period in the intellectual life of Jews living in the Christian regions of northern Spain and in what Jews refer to as Province. During this period, local Jewish thought was enriched by Hebrew translation of important work originally composed in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. Equally important was the new lexicon created by the translator themselves from the Kimchi and Ibn Tibbon families, and of course, Yehuda el-Kharizi. The newly translated text, together with the discourse that developed around them, created an entirely new intellectual context. Out of this context emerged new local writings that made use of the argument, concept, and terminology introduced by the translators. This use was sometimes more conscious and sometimes less so, and it served as a wide range of purposes, at times to challenge traditional views, and at other time to reinforce them, and in most of the cases, both of them at the same time. We usually describe these new intellectual landscapes that emerge in this cultural setting as an arena divided between two opposite camps. On the one hand stand the Aristotelian interpreters of Maimonides, led above all by Samuel ibn Tibbon. On the other hand stand the Kabbalists, whom I prefer to call the Sephirotic writers. The relationship between these two groups has often been discussed in scholarship as though they were two political parties debating with a single theological parliament. At times, philosophers and Kabbalists are presented as occupying neighboring positions on a spectrum, while on the other time, they appear to be bitter rivals. As I have tried to show in recent years, however, this binary picture does not accurately reflect the religious reality of this period. In fact, there were not really two clearly defined camps. What we actually find is a movement of translations and new knowledge, attractive, provocative, and intellectually stimulating, that generated both agreement and opposition, and as I said, in most cases, both at the same time. This dualistic portrayal of Jewish discourse in this cultural context has had additional negative consequences. It has led scholars either to ignore or to distort writers and texts that do not fit neatly into the categories of philosophy or Kabbalah. Thus, for example, Yitzhak ibn Latif was labeled as a Kabbalist or a philosopher and a Kabbalist, although, as Shoei Razes demonstrated in his PhD dissertation, neither category adequately described his writings. Then the same was true with Jacob ben Jacob HaKohen, who was also classified as a Kabbalist, despite the fact that, as Daniel Abrams has demonstrated in his PhD dissertation, only a relatively small and marginal layer in his later writings dealt with Sephirotic themes. A similar fate befell Judah ben Yakar, whom Oded Israelius even described as a Kabbalist against his will. In today's lecture, I would like to continue to examine this issue, but this time not from a broad and general perspective. Instead, I will focus very closely on a single work that cannot easily be assigned to either of the conventional categories of philosophy and Kabbalah. The work is entitled Meshiv Nefesh, and its author is Meir ben Shimon of Narbonne, also known in the very amusing name Hameili. My choice of this text is not accidental. Just as Oded Israeli described Judah ben Yakar as a Kabbalist against his will, Moshe Albert at the time, very happy that here as well, describe Meir ben Shimon of Narbonne as a modest Maimonides who is not a Maimonidean at all. In both cases, it seemed, I thought, that the Hebrew language itself fell silent and possesses only two labels, Kabbalist and Maimonidean, through which to classify medieval Jewish theologian in this region and discourse. Anyone who is neither a Kabbalist nor a Maimonidean is denied an independent category and is instead defined negatively. Like many Jewish authors of this generation, we cannot determine the exact date of Meir ben Simon's birth and death. We don't know we do know, that he authored of two other, except Meshiv Nefesh, work, which have survived. One is Sefer HaMeorot, a commentary on the Rif of several tractates, part of which has been lost and part of which remain extant. He also wrote Milchemet Mitzvah, a collection of texts dealing primarily with polemics against Christianity. Milchemet Mitzvah, whose historical references were dated with remarkable precision by Chen Melech Merchavia to the years 1245 to 1270, is also the work in which Meir ben Shimon is incorporated his attack against Sephirotic writings. From Merchavia's dating, we know that Meir ben Shimon was already a prominent figure in 1245, and he was still alive in 1270, when he edited Milchemet Mitzvah. It is also worth noting that among his treatises that did not survive, there was a commentary on Maaseh Bereshit. Meshiv Nefesh survived in only a single manuscript, Moscow, Ginsburg, 572, which contained a colophon dated to 1469. The work is approximately 14 manuscript pages long and contain roughly 12,000 words. In 2012, Yehuda Hershkowitz published an announced edition of this text, together with a short introduction in the Orthodox journal Yeshurun. As far as for the date of the composition of the work itself, it is difficult to determine with certainty. It is concluding in its concluding lines, there is a reference to Jacob's Anatoly, Malmad Talmidim. It is hard to know, however, whether this reference, which appears at the first glance to be passage inserted into the work, is a gloss added by a later reader, or whether it was written by Meir Shimon himself. I will say in any case, I won't go into the philological considerations, but in any case, if this line does belong to the original text, then Meshiv Nefesh must have been written after Malmad Talmidim was already available to Meir ben Shimon. Since scholars usually date the completion of Malmad Talmidim to around 1250, it would be difficult to date Meshiv Nefesh earlier than the beginning of the 60s. This is certainly a plausible dating, given that Meir ben Shimon was active between 1245 and 1270. So it's a reasonable dating, and I assume that it was written during the 60s of the 13th century. From a scholarly perspective, the most important discussion of the work appears in Moshe Halbertal's book on Menachem HaMeiri. A short discussion containing several interesting insights can also be found in the short introduction of Yehuda Hershkowitz to his edition. I myself discussed several passages of Meshiv Nefesh in my recent book about the beginning of the Kabbalah. Other scholar references to this work, which are not many, are generally being brief and indirect, usually referring back to Halbertal's discussion. Meshiv Nefesh is devoted entirely to a single issue, only to one issue, which is divine providence over individual human being. Meir ben Simon developed a full set of arguments intended to demonstrate God's providence over humanity. Importantly, he does this not in opposition to Maimonides, but rather in defense of him. In Meir ben Shimon's view, Maimonides was both a sage and a righteous man, and therefore he must have believed in divine providence over human beings. In fact, as far as I know, Meshiv Nefesh is the most extensive and comprehensive work from this period devoted solely to the question of providence. The argument of Meshiv Nefesh, if I may summarize it briefly for you, proceeds as follows. At the beginning of the work, Meir ben Shimon declares that his purpose is, and I quote, להורות כי השגחתו יתברך היא על פעולות בני האדם אפילו בדברים הגופניים. In order to prove this claim, he constructs a long and detailed argument. He begins by asserting that everything other than God himself, including the separate intellects, that is, the angel, is created. And for Meir ben Simon, everything that is created is by definition subject to providence, as he writes, and I quote again, הנה בזה כתב זכרו לברכה, שהוא יתברך ברא עולמו, ולשון זה, רוצה לומר בורא, אינו נופל כי אם על עניין מכוון ומושגח, בהיבראו מאת הבורא אותו. The next stage of his argument claims that there is no essential distinction between incorporeal and corporeal things. God created them all. For him, the creation of the separate intellects mean creation in time, and anything created in time is by definition contingent, since it once did not exist and could possibly cease to exist. Thus, from ontological perspective, there is no real difference between corporal and incorporeal beings. All are created entities. From this, Meir ben Simon conclude, and I quote, הנה ביאר בזה זכרו לברכה שידיעתו יתברך היא בנבראים השפלים כמו בעליונים, אין דבר נעלם ממנו, וידיעתו היא השגחתו. ולזה הוציא מלב הדוברים שרה על אדוני, לומר שאין השגחתו יתברך בדברים החומריים. The people who speaks Sarah falsely are the Aristotelian interpreter of Maimonides, who maintain that there is no providence over material existence. Having established that there is no ontological difference between separate intellects and the rest of creation, and there is no difference in the scope of divine providence, Meir ben Simon turns to explain what providence itself actually means. According to him, when Maimonides states that God's providence extends in a proportion to a personal intellectual achievements, he does not mean that intellectual attainment in itself consists providence. Meir ben Simon describes with an open contempt those philosophers who claim that the human soul cleaves to God. According to him, this view is absurd and full of contradictions, and I quote, ולפי דעת קצת הפילוסופים שאין לנפש האדם שום הישארות, אם לא שתהיה בעל שכל וישיג מפליאות הבורא ומציאותו מה שראוי לאדם להשיגו. ואין אלו שגו ולא השיגו לתכלית האמת, כי אין באדם שלא יתבלבל שכלו ככלות כוח הכלים ההם ושאר כלי גופו, שאר כלי הגוף. ועוד שאם תשאל להם על נפש המשכיל בהידבקה לפי סברתם זו, בשכל הפועל, אז תהיה היא והוא אחד. אם מרבה השכל הפועל בה, בהידבק עמה, אם לא. ישיבו לך ויאמרו, כי אין לו בה שום דבר תוספת וריבוי, ואפילו באלף אלפים מנפשות המשכילים. ואחר שהוא כן לפי סברתם זו, אין לנפש המשכיל שום הישארות ויתרון בפני עצמה, גם לא בהידבקה בו. ואחר שהוא כן, טוב לנו שנסמוך על דברי הקבלה המקובלת בידינו, מדברי רבותינו זכרם לברכה, המקבלים איש מפי איש, ומעלה עד משה רבינו עליו השלום. Everyone interested in the use of the term Kabbalah during this period, this is a very good example. This is the person who attacked Kabbalists during this period, so his use of the term is very interesting. Anyone reading these lines could reasonably conclude that Meir ben Simon is rejecting Maimonides himself, yet in his own understanding, he is actually defining Maimonides. According to Meir ben Simon, when Maimonides argued that divine providence over human beings corresponds to their intellectual attainment, he was referring not to the union with the divine intellect, but rather to the human responsibility for one's actions. what we today may call, as Moshe Alberstein defined it, as a criminal responsibility or moral responsibility. The greater a person's intellectual capacity, the greater his responsibility. Thus, individuals lacking intellectual capacity, such as children or mentally incompetent, are exempt for punishment. Ordinary people bear ordinary responsibility, and those possessing greater intellectual attainment are rewarded or punished more severely according to their deeds. And I quote, באישי בני אדם יש הפרש בזה, כי השוטה פטור מכל המצוות, וכן כל איש ואיש לפי חוכמתו ושכלו מחויב יותר במצוות, בגמול ועונש. על דרך זה בא הדרש על מה שכתוב, הגד לעמי פשעם ולבית יעקב חטאתם. וכן דרשו, זכרם לברכה, הגד לעמי פשעם אלו תלמידי חכמים, שהשגגות נעשות להם כזדונות, ולבית יעקב חטאתם אלו עמי הארץ, שהזדונות נעשות להם כשגגות. וידוע הוא כי כל זה מצד השכל השופע באישי האדם באחד יותר על חברו, ועל זה כיוון זכרו לברכה באומרו שההשגחה נמשכת אחר השכל ומדובקת בו. Meir ben Simon explains his motivation for writing his interpretation in several passages that he presents in a very direct terms. According to him, anyone who denies individual providence and claims that the relationship between God and humanity is merely intellectual ultimately lead to turn to secularization or something like that. And I quote, in our term, it will be secularization, of course, not in his. And I quote, ואומרים שהוא רוצה לומר בזה, שאין השגחה במעשה האדם בדברים החומריים, רק בשכל לבד. והנה סותרים כל התורה והמצוות, שאם כן, מי שיחלל שבת באבות מלאכות ותולדותיהם, יש לומר לפי סברתם זו, עליו זכרו לברכה, שהם דברים חומריים, לא יושגח בזה כלל. והנה באתי לבאר דבריו אלו זכרו לברכה, כי חס ושלום, לא רצה זה הרב החסיד זכרו לברכה בזה, ודומה מדבריו יורו על הפך מסברתם זו, בזה ודומה, סליחה, מדבריו יורו הפך מסברתם זו, והיא דיבת שרה גדולה עליו. וכל מי שיורה עליו כך בזה הוא מין ואפיקורס גמור, והוא מכלל המבזים והמספרים שם רע על תלמידי חכמים, גם עם מחטיאי הרבים ומכשיליהם כירבעם בן נבט וחברו וכולי וכולי וכולי, ועליהם נאמר כאילו אומר עזב אדוני את הארץ. Meir ben Simon therefore devotes a long and detailed work to the question that is not merely theoretical but existential. Does God supervise and judge human actions? In his view, failing to answer this question correctly would lead to nothing less than a collapse of the religious life itself. In order to demonstrate both that there is an individual providence and that Maimonides support a straightforward doctrine of providence, Meir ben Simon construct an elaborate framework whose main elements, to summarize once again, is that I will skip this. I think that it was clear. But before concluding, let me add two further observations. First, many of Meir ben Simon claims openly contradict the words of Maimonides himself. And Meir is fully aware of that. And he explained these contradictions in one of three ways. And you have three ways. The first, he suggests that the copyists of Mishneh Torah have made mistake in transmitting Maimonides' writing. The second one, he reports a claim that appears in many other documents of this period, namely that the translator of Maimonides intentionally misled readers and destroyed his teaching, Maimonides' teaching, in order to portray him as an Aristotelian philosopher like themselves. Yet Meir ben Simon does not stop in these two explanations, and he adds, whenever Maimonides himself appeared to endorse a philosophical doctrine, because not everything is a mistake, one must assume that Maimonides, as a God-fearing person, did not truly hold such a view, even if he wrote them explicitly, and I quote, אין לתפוס הרב בדבריו, כי הוא היה חכם גדול, ירא את אדוני, ואין לערער אחריו, וכל אשר ידין דבריו, זכרו לברכה, לפי בלתי ראויים, הוא מין ואפיקורס, ועליו ליטט את הדין, ועדנו לכף זכות, תבוא עליו ברכה. The second point is not less important, that Meir ben Simon sees himself as defender of the ordinary people, that Mike just spoke about, ההמון. A clear example appears in his discussion of the anthropomorphism question. Unlike the Ravad, who criticized Maimonides for declaring anyone who believes in corporeal God to be a heretic, Meir ben Simon goes to other direction and argues that Maimonides himself could not possibly have meant such a thing. According to him, it is inconceivable that Maimonides would regard the common people as heretic, and I quote, מה שאמר לא על אחדים כבני ההמון, והנשים הטובות יראות החטא, כי הן רצויות לשם יתברך, ואף על פי שאינן מכירות ומשכילות בדברים העמוקים, רק שהולכות בתום ליבן. So from those words, I would like to ask the final question of this presentation. Yes, I will finish soon. Take 1 or 2 minutes, not more than that. First, to whom Meir ben Simon actually responding? Who is the audience? Who is the problem over here? Moshe Albertal argued that the first part of Meshiv Nefesh is directed against anti-Maimonidean critics of Maimonides, whereas the second part targets Aristotelian interpreters of Maimonides, above all Ibn Tibbon. I don't think that there are 2 parts to this book, and as a matter of fact, he criticized both of them in all over his treatise, because there is no distinction between them. They both say, according to him, the same. For example, that Maimonides didn't believe in personal providence. One see it in a good way, and the other condemns him for that. The second, where should we place Meir ben Shimon in the world of opinions or attitudes, this moderate Maimonidean who is not Maimonidean at all, within the intellectual spectrum of Jewish thought in this cultural context? To answer this, I would point out that the approaches of most Sephirotic writers of this period, and above all, Ezra ben Solomon, to the issue of cleaving, for example, are, to say the least, far more philosophical than that of Meir ben Shimon. The same true regarding the main issue of the treatise, which is providence. The approaches of most Sephirotic writers, including some of Nachmanides' works, especially his commentary to Job, Asher ben David in his Sefer HaYichud, Isaac the Blind, especially in his epistle to Nachmanides, and Azriel of Gerona, are in fact considerably more philosophical than Meir ben Simon's position. And this brings me to the concluding point, really the concluding, I promise. The description of Judah ben Yakar as a Kabbalist against his will, and Meir ben Simon as a Maimonidean who is not a Maimonidean at all, should not, in my opinion, serve as a meaningful categories. The picture is actually much simpler. Beginning at the mid of the 12th century, and even more strongly from the early 30th century on, the Jewish world of Provence and northern Spain experienced an intellectual renaissance as a result of the translation movement. This movement created something like a box of Lego pieces, concepts, metaphors, ontological assumptions about the nature of God, theological problems and possible solutions. All of these elements entered the Jewish discourse alongside other materials, earlier, liturgical, midrashic, magical, mystical, halachic, and of course, contextual, not Jewish ones. Jewish writers of this reason use these Lego pieces to construct highly diverse intellectual structure of many different kinds. It is therefore misleading to classify all these structure under 2 broad categories called Kabbalah and philosophy. If we do so, we are left with numerous figures who became Kabbalists against their will, and Maimonideans who are not Maimonideans at all. As an alternative, I would suggest that anyone seeking to understand medieval Jewish thought in this period and context should focus less on the general categories and more on the Lego pieces themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tzahi. Our last speaker for this panel is Nikita Wolkenstein. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Center of the Study of Conversion and Inter-Religion Encounters here in Ben-Gurion University. He's a former faculty member at the Center of Islamic and Arabic Studies, Institute of Oriental Studies in Russia, in Russian Academy of Science. The title of his lecture will be Polemical Architecture of Al-Kashari, Rizala, a digital approach to Ashari defense.
Hello, everyone. So maybe the first thing I want you to learn today is the name of my main hero, Abul Qasim al-Kushairi. And he was a proponent of a Ash'ari Kalam school. So it's the second important word that you need to learn today. But first of all, I want to thank Melissa Ishai, Oded, Raya for this opportunity to present results of my latest study among the strongest listeners, right, of our conference. My work examines Al-Kushari's Risala. This is his biggest and most important piece of work, his opus magna. In Arabic, it is called a Risala al-Kushariya fi ilm al-tasawwuf. It means the Kusharian epistle on the science of Sufism, is the mystical Islam, and it is one of the most important works of classical Sufism. Al-Kushari lived in Nishapur in modern-day Iran, and his work is usually read as neutral manual of Sufi doctrine, practice, and terminology. But I argue that it should also be read as a response to a very specific historical crisis, the anti-Ashari campaign in Khurasan during the early Seljuk period. So Al-Kushari was not only a Shafi'i Ash'ari scholar, he was also a Sufi master and a public intellectual. From Tabakat al-Shafi'i al-Kubra, written by Tajuddin al-Subki in the 14th century, we can read a real manifesto by al-Kushari, a public manifesto, in which he defends the philosophy and the method of al-Ash'ari himself. The intellectual world of his time was shaped by this exact conflict between Ash'ari circles in Nishapur and Hanafi Mu'tazili groups in the same city. During this conflict, Ash'ari scholars were denounced, removed from positions of authority, and in some cases imprisoned or exiled. And Al-Kushari himself was directly affected. He was imprisoned by these events, and then he just exiled from the city. He left the city. Several scholars have already noted that Al-Kushari's Risala is not just a neutral collection of Sufi sayings. For instance, Anne-Marie Schimmel comes closer to the argument of my research when she describes the Risala as a presentation of Sufi teaching from the viewpoint of a fully Ash'ari theologian. Arbery offered another important explanation. He argued that the Risala tried to rescue Sufism from the bad reputation caused by antinomian tendencies, especially the Malamatiya. And the modern researcher Mojaddedi offers a crucial structural insight in this topic. He describes the Risala as a dual generic work composed of segmental building blocks that Al-Kushari collected, rearranged, and integrated into a new configuration. So my work takes this observation into the digital realm by treating these segments not only as literary units, but also as data points whose arrangements can be compared across parallel Sufi compilations. So to understand Al-Qushayri's intervention, we might look beyond explicit doctrinal statements and attend to what Franco Moretti calls the great unread. That is the mass of many textual elements that usually escape classical close reading. This includes short reports, sayings, idioms, names, chains of transmission, chapter headings, and even the order, the structure of the book itself. This non-linear nature of the book follows from the composite form of the Risala itself. The work is often approached as both a Sufi tabakat and the manual of Sufi doctrine and practice. Yet structurally, it is closer to a classified compilation or majmua in Arabic, with affinities to a thematically arranged hadith collection or musannaf, while its biographical section preserves a tabakat-like logic. So I treated this biographical sequence as ranking data. Each Sufi figure received a position in the list, first, second, third, and so on. Then I compared Al-Qushayri's order with these three parallel Sufi compilations of the 10th century, early 11th century. Al-Kalabaz's Kitab al-Ta'arruf, Al-Sulami Tabaqat al-Sufiyya, and Al-Hujviri Kashf al-Mahjub. The second step was name normalization. For example, Abu Ishaq Ibrahim bin Ahmad bin al-Muwallad al-Raqi in the unified list is normalized as Ibrahim bin Ahmad al-Raqi. So Arabs are very known for their long names, with kunyas, nisbas, and so on. The next step was to identify the shared corpus between two works. So the problem is that we can't compare two orders without reordering the names of it. Why? So if you remember school math, you maybe know that when we try to calculate distance between cities or towns, for example, we can't count both in kilometers and centimeters, right? So we need to convert centimeters into kilometers. And this principle works here, that we can't just compare two lists with unshared names. It gives a lot of different possibilities, and the results won't be as clear as we can achieve. And so when I identified the shared corpus between these works, I ran positional analysis. It is called also mean absolute rank change or mark. So I took the shared figures, renumbered them inside each text, and calculated how far they move on average. This avoids distortion caused by names that appear in one work but not in another. The first step was the Spearman RHO. So in simple words, if we want to put it in simple words, we can check manually names and order of different Muslim scholars. We can clarify and make a clean list for a positional ranking and positional comparison. And we can also do the next step is finding intervention zones. So how can we do it? We can analyze not each name individually, but different groups of names or clusters. And this method is called rolling window analysis. I won't go into details because it can be difficult to understand at this step. So results of my study, first of all, I wanted to show you this map. This is result of my other study of a social network analysis, just to show you the scope of mystical Muslim scholars from all the Middle East. And the scope of data I'm trying to cope with. And the results that we get I also wanted to emphasize that the data that I collected includes biographies and little details of 162 persons, and we can enlarge this data with their teachers and students. So the whole Magar Netunim and contains about 300 people. So the data is enough, but historically speaking, it is also a way to improve it. And so the results show that Al-Kushari and Al-Kalabazi here, the last one, or the last picture, that they are different completely. And the difference is significant because Al-Kalabazi belongs to a Hanafi school, not Shafi. Hanafi and Maturidi, not Ashari school. While Al-Kushari, he writes from a Shafi, Ashari, Nishapuri setting. And the clearest example of the intervention of the author intervention that we see here in this comparison between Al-Kushari and Kalabazi is the figure of Al-Harith al-Muhasibi that we were already talking today. In Kalabazi's renumbered sequence, he appears not near the end of the shared corpus at position 34. And in Al-Kushari, he appears at the position 7. So such a large shift may indicate that Al-Kushari gives Al-Muhasibi a more foundational role in the Sufi canon. And Al-Muhasibi represents an early Baghdadi form of piety. Al-Kushari writes about Al-Muhasibi's conversion to Sufism, that it appeared after his refusal of a big inheritance of his father. So the problem was that his father was of Qadri views. These views were connected to Mu'tazili realities, and Al-Muhasibi, he rejected 70,000 dirhams. It's a large amount of money, just to put the boundary between himself and his father's legacy. And that's a story that Al-Kushari puts in his biographical section, not Al-Kalabazi, even not Al-Sulami. And the comparison with Al-Sulami and Al-Hujviri gives a different picture. These three works were very similar. And there is only one big exception in the order of the three biographical sequences. This is the figure of Sahel at-Tustari. Sahel at-Tustari, he was a very important early figure in the history of Sufi or proto-Sufi movement. He studied in Abadan, and then he became the father of the Syrian branch of the early Sufi or proto-Sufi movement. And Al-Qushari, for example, he gives only 3 citations of Al-Tustari, and the most important one is as follows. Every deed that the servant of God performs without imitation of the prophet is done to please his own self, his own nafs, whereas every deed performed in imitation of the prophet is painful to the soul. So this saying is very important because it's connected to this ideological conflict of the God's omnipotence and free will. It means that every deed that the servant of God performs, he should do it in imitation of the prophet. And if he doesn't do it, so this deed will be painful to the soul. So the Mu'tazili position was that the person has free will and he can choose to do a good thing or bad thing, and that if he does a bad thing, so he gets a punishment for his deed. But according to this saying, there is a very intimate playing of words. The word imitation in Arabic iqtida is connected to the root kadiya. It means to be sweet. And the word painful, azab, sounds pretty, and is written pretty much as word izab. So painful can also be read as sweet. And it means that in this anti-Mu'tazili polemics, Al-Qushari wants to emphasize that even in each painful decision of God, there is also a sweet part, that it is done not without any other intention of the Shemayim, right? And the intervention zones show us exactly where the sequences were edited by Al-Qushari, and we see that these zones appear near to the Sahel at-Tustari order in each of the 3 books. And also the sequence at the end of each story is also quite different. And that is how we can modulate the discourse, the general discourse of each book. So to conclude, first, the structural comparison shows that Al-Qushari's Risala is not simply a passive continuation of early Sufi biographical writings. The strong evidence comes from the contrast with Al-Kalabazi. So the book of Al-Kalabazi is a Hanafi Maturidi, and it is written in other aims, and the calculated differences are significant. Second, the comparison with a Sulami is equally important because here the sequence is almost unchanged. This gives us a baseline. When Al-Qushayri does move a figure strongly, the movement becomes especially visible. The case of Sahel al-Tustari is the clearest example. His promotion, together with the admission of his student Muhammad bin Salid, may suggest a careful separation between Al-Tustari authority and the more controversial Salimi legacy. And third, a rolling window analysis shows that the most important changes are not scattered randomly across the text. They cluster in specific zones, especially around positions 4 to 15. In this section, Al-Qushayri gathers figures associated with the narrative of refusal, repentance, asceticism, wara', tawakkul, prophetic imitation, and scriptural verification. Maybe that's enough for me today. Thank you so much. I understand that you're very tired. And maybe you were not prepared for a math class today, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nikita. I would invite all the different speakers to come to the table, and maybe we'll have a short Q&A. So I won't speak too much. I'll just say that during this session, I kind of came into my mind that we were talking in these last 2 days about controversies and disputes, but we didn't actually differentiate between inter-religious disputes and inner-religious or inner spiritual movements disputes. And I do think that somehow we do have to do this typology, and that these are not the same things. And what we can see in interreligious disputes are different from what we can see and what we saw in this session, that when people are from the same group and from the same religious ground, they act differently. So this is just my small comment. We won't collect questions. Whoever has a question can ask, and it would be answered. Well, just a few questions. Gershon, please. You have a microphone over there. Yes, yes.
Okay. Gershon, thank you so much for your question. So I can say that there is never enough data in digital humanities. And if we have cross citations in other works, there was such a book written by this or that author, but we can find the book itself, we can modulate it using these methods. How can we do it? By cross citation. So you identify keywords that appeared in each sections with from this book that appeared to be appeared to disappear, right? And then we try to connect these keywords and figures of speech by making clusters of different narratives. And these clusters can be put together if we have a logic of, if we can find an allusion maybe for the order of the book that disappeared. So that's how we can modulate the book, and it's not a new methodology, right? So in the biblical studies, we do the same, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Kana, his microphone.
Okay, I have one. Thank you all for wonderful lectures. I have one question to Boaz and one to Tzahi. So, Boaz, what was the content of this preaching? What did they teach? This the people you were mentioned, many of them, because they I assume there were classes, there were, I don't know, so the content. This is my question, and to Tzahi, did your guy believe in the Sharut Nefesh, or he went back to the Pharisaic preaching of full death and then resurrection? Because he, according to your description, there's nothing, I mean, the differentiation between body and soul is not so clear, and both of them are part of the human existence. Okay.
Okay, so how
On one leg, on one leg.
Lectures, journal, articles, books written. I tried very shortly to give, I think, that the idea of, and the difference between the Theosophists and then the Jewish elaboration of a very difficult doctrine named Blavatsky's book, that the idea of a ancient perennial knowledge passed through different religions, esoteric knowledge, and here Kabbalah.
About the God and the different sections of God.
Angels, previous cycles, evolution. There's a very optimistic idea of human evolution, whose cycles not go only through history, but previous cycles, a classification of different human beings according to the remnants of earlier human development, and also representatives of future development of humanities. These are the Mahatmas, which is a term that may be familiar to you. Belief in supernatural powers, or how supernatural powers can develop. The idea of karma, adopted from a lot of interest in Buddhism, Hinduism. The modern notion of mysticism. Mysticism is important. Interest in Sufism, and a large impact also in religious studies. Get into, but I think some of the assumptions that are accepted, were accepted in religious studies, either overlap and sometimes originate. Some of the scholars of Sufism were Theosophists. Buddhism, Suzuki was a Theosophist. We all use in Kabbalah studies. That is my joke that didn't go very well. You know, the perception of Kabbalah as Theosophy, which is so central, wasn't invented by the Theosophists. That's true, but the Theosophists adopted it. It actually chose the name Theosophy because previously Kabbalah was defined as Theosophy, but I think our perception today of Theosophy is very much influenced and pizza effect by the Theosophists. So again, I don't have
on one leg. And Tzahi?
He didn't have any problem with the soul, with the human soul, of course, and he thought that there is the world to come and there is a resurrection. The only problem that he had is with the assumption that there is any kind of cleaving of union between the human and the divine, the human soul or the human intellect and the divine intellect. He said that I don't understand what it means, because if my mind or my intellect or someone's intellect will unify with God, and God can't change, what do we mean by that? So what happened to that intellect? What do you mean by saying that there is cleaving or even union mystic or union something with God? So he said it's nonsense. You don't understand what he's saying. So, but of course, he tried. Not in all. There is an interesting thing, but he tried to hold every traditional belief that he could. The only thing that is exceptional, and that's the reason why he objected severely to the Sephirotic issues, is the issue of angels. He said that because the Rambam had a clear halacha that it's forbidden and it's really idolatry to worship angels, he said that it's forbidden, and that's the reason why he forbid to say Machnis Rachamim and other things. He didn't forbid it. He said we should be cautious about it. And with regard to the Sephirot, he said it's like angels. So I don't see the difference, and that's the reason why he objected so much. But it all comes from his very traditionalist point of view.
Thank you. Nimrod and then Melissa. Okay. It's up to you. I can stay here the whole night, but the session was supposed to be finished in 10 minutes ago, so we can stay here for Q&A wherever.
My question is Boaz and Tzahi. Boaz, you mentioned that one of the communities was excommunicated. If you can say a few words about what is the mechanism of excommunication of this community, in a nutshell. And Tzahi, you mentioned that you suggest sort of a methodological angle of not talking about these generalizations, but rather the Lego. And I want to ask you, what kind of insights or general observations can you make when you're working with the Lego? In other words, or is this just a stage in scholarship that we have to focus on specifics and then move on? Or is this just the situation that you think captures it the best?
I think so. Yeah, works. I can say, for example, from this presentation, but it goes all the way. I will label Meir ben Simon as a moderate Maimonidean, as scholarship did in most of the cases. I would think that his relationship or his a comparison of him to Kabbalistic literature will put one of them in the more mythical or perspective, and the other one in the more rationalistic or Maimonidean perspective. But the other way around is the truth. So the Kabbalists, or what we call Kabbalists, the Sephirotic writer, are generally saying in this period are more philosophical than Meir ben Simon, and so if I focus on the Lego pieces instead of the building, I can make different comparison between different figures in this period and come to a conclusion that it's not two-dimensional, not even a spectrum. This is not a spectrum. It's very complicated in 3D world. When someone adopted a certain view and another view, I will give you all an example which is very interesting. I published a debate concerning the worship of Metatron. This is how do I say it? Very critical way of people who are worshiping Metatron during this period. I can locate it in around 1250. But it says that those people who worship Metatron also assume that God does not, there is no providence of God over human being, and therefore they worship Metatron. So they took a very radical way of describing, really Maimonidean way of describing God, and then because of that, they worship Metatron. So what can we say about these people? Are they philosophers? Are they mythical people? And they rejected by a spherotic writer. So it's so complicated over there. I suggest that we will focus on really the texts themselves and the ideas that can be supported or rejected during this time. And I think that we will have a better picture and more reliable picture, not ideological one. For this reason, if I may conclude, I will say that if I could give of course, introduction to medieval Jewish thought, I think that this text of Meir is very, very good, because through it we can understand what were the problems. What actually go over there. This is not the text itself, this is rather the context.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nimrod. Well, I think it's a fascinating case of, from the sociological point of view, really we have here, I don't think there were many communities that were excommunicated. And I think it could have happened because it was a community that wanted to preserve traditional Jewish way of life, and they were cut. Well, they were threatened, and when they didn't leave the lodge, the Theosophical Society, the excommunication was read in the synagogues, and they did not receive, they couldn't participate in prayers, did not receive, could not buy kosher food, etc., could not use the local rabbis for marriage, circumcision, and funerals. I think partly it worked, and it is interesting here that they embraced they were quite, it seems to me that they were quite happy about that. They took advantage of it, okay, because they really separated. Actually, they grew much, they became much stronger after the excommunication. We know that there were about 30 Theosophists out of a community of 7,000 people. Now, they grew much after that because they were affluent people in the community. They grew, especially as they opened immediately their own synagogue, they had their own rabbis, and they sold kosher meat much cheaper than the community. Okay, and because of that, actually, there were attempts to reconcile, and the side that had to be reconciled wasn't just the traditional or older community, but also the Theosophists to agree to be reconciled and give up also the economic advantages that gave. I don't have to find the number, but it wasn't just many people. It was me.
When you say they grew, like, did they accept non-Jews? They accepted non-Jews without any ritual.
No, everything is no, from the community, people joined them, although not necessarily they think embrace the Theosophical idea, but they aligned themselves with those people and the services they gave. By the way, they were called by people who still remember from the persons, they were called by their opponents the Tzahi sophists.
I was gonna ask you the question. Okay, my question is about the present. It's for you, Boaz. Like, it was really fascinating, and I think it was great to see, like, in the same panel, very different context and different religion, and how we can see like common dynamics. It was really interesting. But for you, Boaz, I have a question, because I used to work on New Age movements actually in Mexico, and I heard about the Universal Brotherhood there, and actually some Mexican people who even are part of pre-Hispanic revival movements, but not only, because New Age is very open to do several things at a time. And they talked to me about Universal Brotherhood, and including like one branch called the White Brotherhood. I don't know if you heard about it. So this is one. And second, I was wondering, who are the Jewish Theosophists today? Who are their descendants? And can we see any relation of causality with the fact that today Hilonim from Israel go to India in their quest for spirituality? Is there like some kind of continuation there?
Yes. The Religious Brotherhood, etc., they're all a lot of the New Age movements, as I said, are offsprings, offshoots, inspired by what? By Brotherhood, also an idea that the Rashi was in touch with those mysterious masters in the Himalayas. That's the Jewish Theosophists today, you can visit them, and they were quite big in the 50s and 60s, quite big. There were a lot of them. They join sometimes in time. The whole theosophy, you don't need theosophy today because the ideas are all around the practices. So in a way, their success somehow, the success of their ideas and the widespread of them, harm the movement itself, because why go and study theosophy? You want yoga, for instance, in the early 20th century, you would go to a philosopher. Wanted to know about Buddhism, you would go to theosophy, etc. Today, it's over. But definitely, I think part of my enthusiasm is because I really understood it somehow by mistake. Because of the booklet, it was banned. So interesting translation of this Zohar into different languages. And I saw this book, and then I found out it was the Theosophists. And I went to Sasson Somech to help me read Judeo-Arabic and said, yeah, my aunt and uncle were also Theosophists in Basra. And then I found out that they were all over the place.
The idea is that there's more like commonalities between two societies at the same time in histories than between the same society across history. So this is like 19th century like stamp on it. Like it's, yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone, you have a question?
No.
It will be a good one.
Is it somehow connected to Freemasonry?
Yes, and by the way, the group in
The
Basra,
Iraqi Jews, I know
the group in Basra, I didn't. They were also.
But the same people?
The same people were many times. It's very interesting that Freemasonry didn't. There were problems with Freemasonry. It's not that they had it, but it never ended in. My knowledge, there was no communication. I think the reception of Masonry was more somehow less controversial than the Theosophists, probably because of the picture of the snake. I think that, this is two things that really feel more problematic to digest.
All about that and more in Boaz's new book. Any other questions to Michael?
Quick thought. I was just thinking, maybe you mentioned it, but I missed it. But I was thinking a little bit like about Moshe Bill's distinction between primary elite.
So I mentioned him in the last slide. Also, fair. I mean, not that perhaps in addition to what scholars talk about in terms of trying to explain. Are also sort of a focal deep and not necessarily reflects deep social that is carried on from earlier centuries. See it also Bachya in a certain perspective. Doesn't mean that they're reality, real social reality that are reflected in the text, but it's also a way of mystics in these centuries to find themselves. Create something new.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melissa and Shai and Oded and Raya.
Yeah, I think so. Let's take 15 minutes to the plenary discussion. Then it will be a bit shorter than planned. Don't worry, we won't finish too much later. But then, so we can have a break, come back at 25, and have a little common discussion. You want the break shorter? Does anyone else want the break to be shorter? Yeah? Okay, so you want what, at 20? We meet at 20? It's 11 now. Yeah, at 20? Okay, 4:20.
So we're working with